Yes, you saw that. That's now officially been announced that our friend Howard Stern is canceled, like somebody who made a joke that offended somebody with left-wing politics. You know, like the kind of thing that our friend Howard Stern made his career off of. The guy who did blackface so many times and who did blackface with increasingly disturbing and scary makeup prosthetics attached to it. But remember, when you spend decades saying or doing one thing and suddenly you're going to go and now act so like totally something different, people are going to believe you being a complete liar, unless they are so easily fucking led, like the way leftists usually tend to be, where the only thing consistent about them is the letter next to their name. So as long as somebody out there is in the mainstream and they're saying what is going to be signal boosting dogshit left-wing dogma, Howard Stern, the man who spent years giving airtime to Klansmen and to neo-Nazis, and who having porn stars show up on his show so he could have them on the Sibian, or that having a different porn star on the show and having her open her mouth so that one of his interns could spit in her open mouth. So Howard Stern, the man who drove a woman to trying to force her into making up stories about having swinger parties at her home, to the point of her being in tears. Now Howard Stern is the type of man, although if you remember what Harlan Ellison had to say about a Stern when Ellison was appearing on The Tomorrow Show in the 90s, and somebody was calling in to ask him about Howard Stern, and Ellison rightfully said, Stern must just have a bunch of interns calling into shows and TV shows and radio shows just so we can hear his name. Howard Stern is really a 13-year-old transvestite, and an ugly one to boot. Well, really, he looks more like a guy who can't decide if he's trick-or-treating as Johnny Ramone or as Yoko Ono or as Geddy Lee from Rush, so he decides to go as all three. And yet, Stern is the same guy who did things like that. And now, the same guy who went and had a guy see if he could break the world record for the most farts on the air. Yeah, the guy Stern who really is doing all these horrible things, all these edgy, offensive things for the attention and for the ratings, now suddenly is pretending to be offended by the guy he spent years glorifying. Let's not forget about that. Because, well, remember, with Howard Stern, him being a kind of pathological, neurotic, and narcissistic liar, he always needs somebody to blame for all of his failures, because he can never accept who he is as an awful person. He can never take his own responsibility for being a failure. He's a lot like Vosh that way, except as far as I know, Stern is not obsessed with signal boosting, wanting to fuck kids. Now, his big thing is babysitter porn. But at least with the babysitter porn, the performers have to be over 18, unlike Vosh's preferred porn. But then you go in all this and you look at this and then you see, yeah, that guy who then was pretending to be all angry at Don Imus, mainly because Don Imus was competing with him on the same WANBC back in the 80s. And then then when all that drifted away, and then for the longest time, you had, of all things, Howard Stern actually being friendly with Jay Leno, and even Stern appearing on Jay Leno when he was hosting The Tonight Show in the 90s. And then, because Leno looked uncomfortable or was questioning Stern having hookers or strippers on his show, on there with him as guests, now suddenly he was all angry about Jay Leno and spent the entire 2000s going from all the blind hatred and neuroses and projection, which is really what he was doing towards Don Imus, then was transferred over to Jay Leno. And then Stern starts selling his soul and turning his show into one celebrity brown-nosing interview after another, including a brown-nosing interview where he was glorifying Harvey Weinstein around the time that the film The King's Speech came out, one of the many sleep-inducing Best Picture winners that Weinstein produced, because he wound up keeping the Oscars in a stranglehold. And then after all that, the same businessman that he went and glorified for decades on end to spite Don Imus, because Don Imus, back in that time in the 80s, was feuding with our nation's 47th and 45th president. Well, it turns out that Stern absolutely positively deserves the wet fart of an ending to his legacy. The man to whom was always a disgusting, insecure little bitch. Whether or not you found his act funny, that's just what it was. An act. For a guy who built his whole attention whore show around pretending that that was really him. Every interview for any Tom, Dick, and Harry interview he did when he was starting to get press, when it came to his breakout time on DC 101, and then getting up there to WNBC, and then to K-Rock, and then into Sirius XM, he was always, this is me. This is the raw Howard. Oh, no, I'm not putting on an act. Nope, turns out the whole time it was all an act. No wonder when it came to doing a movie, there was no established actor he wanted playing Stern, because it turns out there is no real Howard Stern. There is whatever is going to get him accepted in the mainstream media world, okay?